China is everywhere in Africa. From the bustling markets to the construction sites, the presence is unmistakable. From shiny new roads and railways that crisscross the continent, to bustling ports and airports, Chinese investment is transforming the continent at an unprecedented pace. But this generosity comes at a price. The financial agreements and handshakes often mask deeper implications. Many say China is not just helping Africa, it's taking control. The streets echo with protests and graffiti, voicing concerns over foreign influence. Is China's influence in Africa a force for good or a new form of colonialism? Scholars and experts are divided on this issue. Let's dig deeper to find out. Through investigative journalism and local interviews, we seek the truth. Some argue that China is simply filling a void left by the West. Decaying infrastructure and abandoned projects tell a story of neglect. They say that Western countries have neglected Africa for too long, leaving it vulnerable to exploitation and in dire need of development. China, on the other hand, is seen as a more reliable partner, willing to invest in projects that benefit both sides. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure are being built. Others are not so sure. Skepticism runs high among leaders and citizens alike. They point to the fact that China is primarily interested in Africa's resources. The focus on mining and oil extraction raises eyebrows. They argue that China is using its economic might to extract as much oil, gas, and minerals as possible, shipping them back to fuel its own growth, leaving little for the African people. The promises of prosperity often ring hollow in the face of displacement and poverty. China's relationship with Africa is not new. It stretches back through the annals of history, marked by significant interactions and exchanges. As far back as the 15th century, Chinese explorers sailed to the east coast of Africa, establishing trade links that would last for centuries. These early voyages were the beginning of a long and complex relationship, but it was in the 20th century, with the rise of a new China, that the relationship took on a whole new dimension. The political and economic landscape was changing rapidly, and both regions saw opportunities for mutual benefit. After gaining independence, many African countries turned to China for support. They sought assistance in building their nations and looked to China as a model for development. China, eager to win friends and allies, was happy to oblige. The Chinese government saw Africa as a strategic partner in its global ambitions. This period saw a flurry of activity, with China providing aid, building infrastructure, and training African workers. Roads, railways, and schools were constructed, symbolizing the growing bond between the two regions. This early cooperation laid the foundation for the much deeper relationship we see today. The groundwork was set for future collaborations in various sectors. It also established China as a reliable partner, willing to work with African countries on their own terms. Today, this partnership continues to evolve, driven by shared goals and mutual respect. One of the most visible signs of China's presence in Africa is its significant investment in infrastructure projects across the continent. From roads and railways to ports and power plants, China is playing a crucial role in building the physical foundations of a modern Africa, aiming to boost connectivity and development. This infrastructure boom is transforming the continent, connecting people and markets like never before, and fostering economic growth and regional integration. Take Ethiopia, for example. Once a byword for famine and poverty, Ethiopia is now one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, thanks in part to strategic investments. This remarkable transformation has been fueled in part by Chinese investment in infrastructure, including a new railway line connecting Addis Ababa, the capital, to Djibouti, a major port on the Red Sea, enhancing trade routes. The railway has slashed journey times and significantly reduced transport costs, making it easier for Ethiopian businesses to get their goods to market efficiently and competitively. It is just one example of how China is helping to unlock Africa's economic potential, paving the way for a brighter future through strategic infrastructure development. China's engagement with Africa is not just about bricks and mortar, it's also about building strong diplomatic relationships. China has been particularly active in cultivating ties with African governments, offering them a combination of aid, investment, and political support. This no-strings-attached approach has proved popular with African leaders, many of whom are wary of the West's lecturing on human rights and democracy. China, on the other hand, is happy to do business with anyone, regardless of their human rights record. This has led to accusations that China is propping up dictators and undermining democracy in Africa. But China insists it is simply respecting the sovereignty of African nations and allowing them to choose their own path to development. There is no doubt that China is interested in Africa's vast natural resources. China is the world's biggest consumer of raw materials, and Africa is richly endowed with everything from oil and gas to copper and cobalt. This has led to accusations that China is simply interested in exploiting Africa's resources for its own benefit. Critics point to the fact that many of the deals struck between Chinese companies and African governments are shrouded in secrecy. They also argue that Chinese companies often bring their own workers and materials, leaving few benefits for local communities. However, it is important to note that Chinese companies are not the only ones operating in Africa. Western companies have been extracting resources from Africa for centuries. It is important to remember that Africa is not a monolithic entity. It is a vast continent with 54 different countries, each with its own history, culture, and political system. To say that China controls Africa is a gross oversimplification. It is true that China has a lot of influence in Africa, but this influence is not always exercised in a coercive way. In many cases, African countries are willing partners in this relationship, eager to benefit from China's investment and expertise. Ultimately, the relationship between China and Africa is a complex one, with both opportunities and risks for both sides. There is no doubt that China's engagement in Africa has created winners and losers. On the one hand, Chinese investment has helped to boost economic growth and create jobs. It has also led to improvements in infrastructure, healthcare, and education in some countries. On the other hand, some communities have been displaced by Chinese-funded projects. There have also been concerns about environmental damage and labor exploitation. In some cases, Chinese companies have been accused of putting profits before people. It is important to ensure that China's engagement in Africa is sustainable and benefits all parties involved. This requires greater transparency, accountability, and a commitment to responsible investment. The relationship between China and Africa is at a crossroads. While there are many benefits to this partnership, there are also growing concerns about debt sustainability, environmental degradation, and the lack of transparency in many deals. African countries are becoming more assertive in their dealings with China, demanding better terms and greater benefits for their citizens. China, for its part, is realizing that it needs to be more sensitive to the concerns of its African partners. The future of this relationship will depend on both sides working together to address these challenges and build a more equitable and sustainable partnership. China's growing influence in Africa is part of a wider shift in the global balance of power. As the West retreats from the world stage, China is stepping in to fill the void. This has led to speculation that we are witnessing the emergence of a new world order, one in which China plays a leading role. It remains to be seen what this new world order will look like. But one thing is for sure, China's engagement with Africa is likely to have a profound impact on the 21st century.